Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. Yesterday, the schools regulator, Ofsted, released their report on 21 Birmingham schools after allegations of pupils being vulnerable to Islamic extremism. It was triggered by a mysterious letter known as the Trojan Horse Letter, which stated that a small group of Islamic fundamentalists had taken over the management of the schools and were forcing them to teach under religious rather than secular principles. While the origins of this letter are still unknown, the report said that some staff and students felt intimidated by the school's governors into following religious principles, including some cases of gender segregation, the banning of music lessons and compulsory Arabic. As a result, the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, has called for stricter measures to regulate state schools. He announced that Ofsted would be allowed to carry out inspections without notice, and that all teachers would have to teach so-called British values. Both statements have been condemned by the National Union of Teachers. And many staff in Birmingham schools have hit out against these statements. They say the whole issue has been grossly exaggerated and that there was little evidence of any Islamic takeover at all. And many have also said the incident is being used as a political football ahead of next year's general election, and that it has deeply distressed many of their pupils just as they're taking their exams. So what did happen in Birmingham? And did politicians and the media distort and sensationalise these events? And what kind of effect will it have, not just in Birmingham schools, but in other areas where there are a high percentage of Muslim pupils? Joining me to discuss this are Dr. Brooke Rogers, who is the reader in Risk and Terror at King's College London, Gus John, Honorary Fellow and Associate Professor at the Institute of Education. On Skype, we're joined by Salma Yaqub, a former Birmingham City Councillor and organiser of the group called Hands Off Our School, and on the phone, humanist blogger and activist John Sargent. Welcome to you all. Salma Yaqub, let me start with you. I know you've got many complaints against this Ofsted report, but just give us two or three which you think are the most important ones.
I think the main thing is how outstanding schools are now being labelled as inadequate. And we believe this is politically driven. Of course, we all want our children to be safe. We all want our children to do well. And if there were some issues, we need these addressed. But the way this has happened, we believe that the impartiality and the integrity of Ofsted has been seriously compromised. Parents and children have put in formal complaints as to the kind of questioning that they were facing. Staff members have also done witness statements, which is why there's a judicial review going on. The schools have rebutted these allegations in very, very strong terms. So, for example, Parkview at the centre of this has a Sikh gentleman as a head teacher. The leading governor is an Anglican priest, and their assistant principal is agnostic. They had a very powerful book yesterday where they said, how would it be possible for them to be allowing or promoting Islamic extremism in their school? They firmly reject these accusations. And this has been malicious. This has condemned not just Birmingham Muslims, but the whole of our city. So Hands Off Birmingham Schools is about saying that we don't accept these findings. And there is a campaign now to bring people together to say that we need Michael Gove to step out of politically interfering in this way.
I think, unfortunately, the sound quality is not too good on your telephone line. We'll just watch the VT report, which we've prepared, and if we can improve the line and you're still available, we'll come back to you. Thank you very much, Salma Yaqub. Let's have a look at this video report.
5 out of the 21 Birmingham schools accused of being taken over by Muslim hardliners have now been placed under special measures. The verdict has already sparked a parliamentary debate at the highest levels on what constitutes extremism.
Ofsted concluded that governors are trying to impose and promote a narrow, faith-based ideology in what are non-faith schools, specifically by narrowing the curriculum, manipulating staff appointments, and using school funds inappropriately. Things that should not have happened in our schools were allowed to happen. Our children were exposed to things they should not have been exposed to. As Education Secretary, I'm taking decisive action to make sure that those children are protected.
What is clear from the reports that have been published today is that the central charge that there has been an organised plot to import extremism, which has in fact radicalised children in Birmingham, has not been met. What there has been is unacceptably poor and bad governance, which has let children, parents and staff down and which must be tackled. but these two things are not the same. Does the Secretary of State therefore regret the tone of the debate, which has sent a clear message to Muslim parents in Birmingham and beyond that the education of their children will be viewed through the prism of national security?
Ofsted, the education watchdog, found no evidence of extremism in the schools. However, inspectors have expressed concerns that a narrow range of subjects is being taught in cultural isolation. The question for many now is whether this type of religious conservatism leads to radicalization. Parkview and Old Now Academy are two of the 5 schools being placed under special measures. A week before the Ofsted report was published, I went to Birmingham to speak to parents and teachers at these schools to hear what they thought about the allegations.
I found Old Now Academy has been all about progression of the children, reading, writing, maths, nothing else, nothing worried about RE or agendas or nothing like that.
We are really sad because when this school is 89% in levels. 2013 report, when inspectors came in, they praised this school. We got #1, outstanding in teaching and learning, outstanding performance. The children were outstanding. The trips that we take the children on to Saudi Arabia, that was actually praised on the international links. And then 12 months on, we get inspectors come in and they're saying it's radicalised.
To upset some of the parents was the line of questioning adopted by Ofsted inspectors, focused on the implementation of the PREVENT programme, a set of counter-terrorism measures.
The school is failing because you're not implementing the PREVENT policy. These are 7-year-old children, 7 to 11. It's the age of innocence.
But to me, it was just very inappropriate, some of the questions. Then they said, but this is the type of questions that we would ask people that are part of the BNP or that are part of the EDL too. They act EDL too.
The trust responsible for 3 of the schools being placed under special measures has denied promoting extremism. Governors accept that there have been changes in the way the school is run, but stress this has been in the interest of the children.
At the time we joined here, it wasn't a comfortable school to work in. It wasn't a comfortable school to come as a governor because the majority cultural and ethnic background of the pupils wasn't recognised.
The quality of the education at that time wasn't very high. For example, my child, although we speak only English at home, he was when he came to the school, he was automatically registered as a child that has English as an additional language, just because he spoke English with an accent.
The school went into special measures in 1996, and as a result of that, something drastic had to be done to instigate school improvement, and we took it on ourselves to take on that work and do it. Part of that was to recognise the cultural and ethnic background of the pupils.
What began as an investigation into misconduct of governors within a handful of schools has turned into a national debate which sets to redefine the boundaries of extremism. Flaminia Jambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, Dr. Brooke Rogers, I mean, do you recognise that there were elements of extremism in what was uncovered by Ofsted?
I've been reading as much as I can of the media reports of the reports, and I think some of the main issues that are striking and coming out of these discussions is that staff have felt uncomfortable and unable to raise their views or issue challenges if they're uncomfortable with the way in which some of the lessons have been run, or maybe some of the activities have been either taken off of the curriculum or segregated. So those are the issues that have struck me coming out. I'm a psychologist and I'm a social psychologist, so I'm really trying to look at this more in terms of the processes of radicalization and what that might mean. You know, if I go back quite a few years to the days when I was a young postdoc, I took part in a Joseph Rowntree-funded project called Parenting in Multiracial Britain, and we went out into communities, many different communities, and asked parents how they taught their children about identity and how they thought the schools should be responsible, and if the schools should be responsible for informing and shaping that identity. And we were trying to find that golden nugget British identity, and we could not.
But when you say that some staff felt intimidated, I mean, you felt it was true that they couldn't raise complaints and they were risking being fired?
Well, I haven't seen the evidence with that, and I think I might have to defer to my colleague in terms of the way in which the schools are managed. But the reports that are coming out, especially the media reports, which will always have an angle, are saying that staff were reporting in some of the schools that they felt that they could not express their views and that they were at risk of being fired if they did. So as an academic myself, responsible for educating young and old, I would not want to work in that kind of environment. But I need to see the evidence rather than just the media report.
Well, Gus, John, have you seen the evidence? Do you think there is evidence?
Well, I have not seen the evidence. I haven't read all of the Ofsted reports. I have seen extracts of them reported upon. What I would say is this. What beggars belief about this whole thing? It is as if the management of these schools was somehow completely crippled or displaced by whoever it was that's being accused of trying to take over the schools. These kinds of issues happen in schools every day. Governors and the influence they try to exert upon head teachers, different factions of teachers within a school or a particular staff room. They're not new things, but it is the role of managers to sort them out. And if somebody has a problem about how they're being treated, most teachers in schools these days are members of trade unions. So there are mechanisms for sorting those things out. What I can't understand is why it is being assumed that all of this was happening inside of some kind of a vacuum, or that everybody was so scared of everybody else that it rendered them impotent.
Also, that it all happened within a few months, because most of these schools had been previously inspected not so long ago.
Well, that's right. And I mean, let me make two more points about that. It's very difficult to tell what guided Ofsted when it did that first round of inspections and the schools got these glowing reports, and the guidance that they used, the framework they used this time as a result of this Trojan horse letter, because it doesn't fit, you see. And let me tell you, one of the reasons why I agreed with a couple of the parents in your clip is this. In 2014, April, the government issued, the DFE, Department for Education, issued some guidelines called Keeping Children Safe in Education, Statutory Guidance for Schools and Colleges. Nowhere in that document, 2 months ago, nowhere is the word extremism used once. There is one reference, and I read it through from top to bottom. There's one reference to radicalization, and that's not discussed as an initiative of the government, but of this channel program that they have involving multi-agencies and the police and so forth. In other words, Ofsted was not itself focused on extremism, nor have head teachers and governors been given any guidelines in terms of what extremism is, how it can be detected, and what they should do about it. Well, so it seems as if Ofsted, the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, everybody is just making it up as they go along.
Well, John Sargent, I mean, let's pursue that point that Gus John just made. I mean, some of the things that were said about these schools in the Ofsted report are not what they taught, but what they didn't teach. And one of the things that I found in the report, it says that schools had not taken steps to protect the pupils from the risks of radicalization and extremism. Well, as Gus John has said, the department itself hasn't ever explained what radicalization and extremism is or what steps should be taken, and now they're being accused of not taking these steps that have never been defined. I mean, do you see a real problem here for Ofsted, that it's changing the goalposts as it goes along?
Well, I don't think it's so much changing the goalposts. I think the government has announced, for example, a report from its task force when it was looking into the events of the tragically Rigby murder, for example, and we've also got the prevent strategies there. I think one of the problems that was mentioned earlier was teachers didn't feel that they could actually report adequately their concerns. And one crucial timing issue that has to be considered is that the whistleblowing, for example, at the Parkview School happened before the Trojan horse letter came into the public domain. So I think that's a critical thing to mention. That certainly didn't help. It created a sensationalist approach to what are very serious issues which are regarding the education and the safeguarding of children.
Well, are you suggesting that whoever wrote the Trojan horse letter was following on from something that had happened in Parkview and they sort of exploited that issue, you mean?
Well, I think those of us that looked at it at the time, certainly when I was discussing it with other humanists, we felt that if this was a really organised conspiracy plot, the last thing you would codename it is Trojan horse. So we sort of looked at it and it looked like, to my mind, it was probably more something to try and have a spotlight on these issues. Because don't forget, Michael Gove mentioned that these things were raised in 2010, many years ago, and it seems like no one was really looking at these issues. So they've been allowed to fester to a point where teachers felt they had to look outside their trade unions and others to say what was going on. And the key thing here is the children. We've got to try and move away from the polarization debate of whether extremists are suddenly coming in with creeping Shira or going through to this is something to victimize Muslims. We have to look at the fact that our schools have to have religious studies. It's got to be comparative. It's got to be broad so that they can cope with a multicultural Britain. It's not got to be defined by a narrow religious instruction almost. And that's been the concern, I think, which I do urge everyone to go to the Ofsted website and actually read the reports from themselves so that they can make their own minds up and avoid any of the spin that's out there.
Well, Dr. Rogers, what do you think? I mean, this definition of radicalisation and extremism, how would you define these things?
If I were to define extremism, I would consider it to be, we would usually refer to political views or political ideologies that go against society's fundamental beliefs and values. Those can be fundamental beliefs and values that are openly discussed within legislation, but they can also be fundamental beliefs and values that are shared amongst members of society from their shared history and shared discourse. When I think about radicalization, I think about changes in attitudes that actually move an individual towards a greater acceptance of violence, and therefore it increases the likelihood that at some point they might actually engage in violence. It doesn't mean that they will, but radicalization is different to extremism. We can have extreme views. It depends on what you do with those extreme views. So extremism in itself is not a dangerous concept. If you become radicalized, however, that means that you're moving towards violence or more accepting of violence, and therefore we need to sit up and take note.
But is there an issue about what individual teachers' personal views may be and what they tell the classroom? Just because a teacher has certain views, can you assume automatically, or do you have to assume, for the sake of argument, that they are teaching the kids those same views that they hold?
Well, some may be and some may not be. The issue here, I think, is this. How do you define what the curriculum is? How do you ensure that each teacher is actually delivering the curriculum as it is meant to be delivered? And where do you draw the line between the belief systems of, I don't know, a majority of children in the school, whether they be Christian or Muslim, and what is actually taught? Because you see, there is a fundamental problem, it seems to me, which is it has never been defined where religious instruction ends and a general ethos of respect for other religions, etc., begins. Okay, we know that there's been all this talk about who needs to take part in some form of religious observance or whatever it is in schools. And if you of one particular faith, you could apply to be disallowed from that. But the main issue is, do we have a secular schooling system or don't we? At the moment, everybody assumes that we do. But you've got other faith schools, Jewish, Christian, different kinds of Christian schools, and so on. And it is to be expected, if you're going to give schools and the governing bodies the right to not follow the national curriculum, to do all of the things that they've been freed up to do by Mr. Gove and others, you must expect that there would be tendencies within Islam who would want to exploit that and be true to what they believe.
Well, it's one way around it then to go back and insist that these academies follow the national curriculum.
Well, but I mean, that would be one way, because I can't understand, if you have a national curriculum, how can it be national if certain types of schools are allowed not to just ignore it completely? It doesn't make sense.
Well, John Sargent, what do you think? Do you think there should be a national curriculum? And if, I mean, why has Michael Gove allowed these schools to break away from the national curriculum when he seems to be wanting to lay down from Westminster certain principles anyway, which is to impose on people when he's just given them the autonomy that now he wants to take away?
Well, it's one of the things that we were raising at the time. I think when we're talking about secular schools, we have concern about faith schools generally, and I really don't like how some people try to say this is particularly targeted towards Muslims or Islam. We need to make sure that our schools are a place free for children to be educated, to learn about other faiths and none as well, and that they can do so with making sure that they are actually equipped to integrate fully into British life. And that's the concern, that it hasn't been laid down religious education so that we can have a proper religious studies as an academic subject. It's pretty much piecemeal, and certainly Michael Gove hasn't helped in creating free schools which have autonomy. And I think we're going to find that a can of worms will be opened because of this issue. I know, for example, that Sonny Hundle has got an expose coming out on some Christian free schools. So watch this space. There's a lot of these issues are going to be raised in the coming days, I'm sure.
Well, on that note, we'll have to come to the end of this section of the programme. In the second half, we'll be talking about faith schools in more detail, and this issue that Michael Gove raised in Parliament this week, that schools should now teach British values. We'll be asking, what are British values and how do you teach them? So stay with us.